Anyone who's been a long-time follower of Unsung Heroes will know that I love vehicles, not just cars but even bikes as well, that use unconventional power plants. It's one of the easiest ways that you can get creative with an otherwise normal vehicle. You take something like a clapped-out Nissan Micra, nobody cares. You put a turbine engine in it, everybody cares. It's a simple way of making a car kind of a cult classic legend in its own right, and we've talked about some like that before. This one falls into that category as well, however, it's not exactly a looker. No, this is sort of a Marmite car, I would say. I could see some people liking it in a kit car kind of way. Other people, and I'm one of those people, would probably say, it's not really for me. It definitely has a convincing kit car / hot rod look to it, but it's not exactly as well proportioned as a supercar would typically be, or maybe a race-derived machine. But that's the curious thing, because this vehicle, built and designed by Barry Watkins, called the Sundoulous Sportstar, or the Sportstar 1, technically, was a car that was designed to do just that, to race. Way back around the year 2000, Barry actually wanted this car to compete against Vipers and Corvettes in Grand Am racing. And that original plan involved not only these looks that the car still has, of course it would have been slightly different as a race car, but the same essential shape, combined with a pretty impressive 3.2-litre twin-turbo pushrod V8 engine with a red line of up around 10,000 RPM and a power output of close to 1,000 horses. Now that would have been one hell of a race car, and of course regulations and various rules on different events would have altered that power output considerably, but still, that's a cool essential idea. However, something which is familiar to any racing episode pretty much of this series, the rulebook changed, and much like many of the cars that we've talked about before, the car was killed, because the rulebook went more so in favour of Daytona prototype style machines, and this car was not eligible for that. Now, this is where the story actually gets more interesting, because everything about the car seems almost generic. Up until this point. Some guy wanted to take it racing, ended up maybe being a kit car instead. It doesn't really sound that special, but it really is, for two reasons. One is the engine, and the second is the purpose. Because what Barry Watkins decided to do with the Sportstar was pretty admirable. He decided to use it as a wacky, experimental show car of a sort, but, and here's the key, a car designed to raise money for charities, to be a centerpiece show car at fundraising events where people could, for instance, bid on in a non-ownership sense, get a whole group of rich people, celebrities, have a bidding war for the fun of it to support various charities. And that was the purpose of the car, to go to these different events, some of which he himself arranged and attended, and to raise tons of cash for all of these different charities, as I said, including, as one example, the Free Wheelchair Mission, which is designed to provide, as the name suggests, free wheelchairs for those in need in third world countries, and various other things as well. Now that immediately takes this car from being ho-hum to respectable, as far as I'm concerned. Now that's all well and good, but what about for us petrol heads? Well, here's where it gets cool, because the power plant that he chose for this sports car was from Harley Davidson. In fact, a twin-cam 88 Harley V-twin. Except, he didn't just use one of them. This car has two Harley engines mated together to make a four-cylinder, technically W4 engine, I guess you could say, in a weird kind of sense, and these engines only put out about 100 horses each. The goal was ultimately to get them up to about 160 each, which of course would total between 200 and 320 horsepower, depending on where they ended up, but in a car that weighed barely over 2,000 pounds. So it would have been quick, and pretty unique to listen to, probably at the same time. So this idea is going from being kind of ho-hum, as I said, to actually this is getting pretty interesting. A twin Harley engine car designed to be a show-stopping car that would also raise money for charity. Very interesting and definitely unique idea. And the amazing thing is, they actually did make it work. Apparently they took some people out in the car and it was a drivable machine, albeit with some issues. because of course when you've got two separate engines which haven't been engineered by some big company like Volkswagen or Ford specifically from day one to be a twin-engine vehicle, well of course you're going to have some issues with stuff like timing, for instance. Now they had it on a belt system, as you'd expect, and you can kind of see that in some of the images, but the timing was never quite right between the two engines, and from what I understand, and from the albeit limited information that you can find online, it seems that that kind of killed the project in the long term. And although that's a disappointment from a certain sense, I don't find it disappointing for two reasons. One is because they did make it work, even with those issues, so it wasn't a failure. And the second thing is, you've got to go back to the purpose of the car. It wasn't built to race anymore. It was built to raise money. So at a certain point, when you're spending this kind of time, and doubtless money as well, trying to engineer something which ultimately isn't really going to be driven all that often anyway, well, you're kind of going against the point of the car. The idea was to make it a fascinating vehicle to raise cash, not a vehicle which turned into an endless money pit trying to make it work. So I actually admire the idea of leaving the project alone eventually when you just cannot make it work as you wanted. And that is certainly not something that you'd hear me say in many of these episodes. Now, I mentioned the weight of the car earlier on, and it wasn't just a case of a cool engine with an interesting little fiberglass kit car body. There was a ton of effort and engineering prowess put into this car. For a start, the body is actually carbon fiber, finished in black chrome, and speaking of chrome, the details, some of which are questionable as far as being a pretty car or not, such as the grille and the surrounds for the lights, they're actually billet aluminium. And for those who don't know, that means that they weren't cast, they were cut out of a block of aluminium into that exact shape of the grille. That's pretty cool. I love that kind of craftsmanship. And going back to those twin Harley engines for just a second, they were incidentally mated to a Corvette transaxle. So even though originally it didn't rival Corvettes, you still got a little bit of Corvette DNA in there at the end of the day anyway. But, curiously, the Corvette connection does not end there, because technically, this car was superseded by another one-off vehicle, which is even less known than this one. In fact, you could easily think it was the same car that had just been visually altered, called the Shadow. SHA-DO. This vehicle was finished, I believe, in 2007 from what I could find. It looks very similar. The grille is a little bit more hot rod-esque. In fact, the overall appearance of the Shadow embraces the hot rod idea a lot more than the original, which is very clearly going for more of a Can-Am or prototype kind of appearance, and it has more of a closed-off back end as well rather than the fully exposed mechanicals. And in a sense, it probably works better as a fundraiser kind of car because you can drive it more easily, and the reason why is it's much more conventional. But slow, I don't think it would be, because it's powered by a 7-litre Corvette engine, mated to none other than a Ford GT transaxle. So performance is pretty much guaranteed. And if those other engineering aspects were carried over, for instance, from the first project to this one, then chances are it has something like a carbon fiber body again, and maybe even some of those similar billet components. So the weight is likely still pretty low. I mean, I would expect it weighs more with a Corvette 7-litre instead of two Harley engines, but the weight is probably comfortably still below 3,000 pounds, and it's not going to be an underpowered engine, that's for sure, certainly more than 320 that those original Harley engines were going for. So ultimately, it's definitely a project which, in its original and wackier form, didn't quite achieve the perfection that Barry Watkins wanted from the idea, but it did, at least to some degree, fulfill its dream of earning cash for those charities. It never got to actually race, of course, but you could say that for all of its failure in racing, it actually achieved more important things, which is a pretty cool twist, I think, to the Unsung Heroes story. So it's a car that definitely won't appeal to everyone in terms of the visuals, but it will appeal to us petrol heads for having a crazy twin Harley engine, and of course it can appeal to you on a more moral ground, because what better idea than to be creating a car that looks cool and captures attention for the purpose of helping people, as this one did, and even as the Shadow seems to as well. Ultimately though, that's it for this episode. Of course, if you are a fan of the car, you should click the link down below, jump over to the live chat for the channel, and go to the voting polls where you can click on this one if you're a fan of it, along with all of the previous episodes that we've talked about. And speaking of which, if you are by some chance new to the channel or new to Unsung Heroes, There are tons of other episodes to look at, and you can see those by clicking the playlist here on screen. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.